Have you ever finished a video game and immediately found yourself in a grieving process, realizing there would never be anything quite like that game ever again, that you want to delete your memories so that you can feel and experience that thing again for the first time? I can think of no game more prominent in this feeling for me than Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is unique throughout the entire landscape of gaming, and also even within its own series. My recent playthrough of Final Fantasy X taught me why this game is still loved over 2 decades later, and by many is considered to be the last great masterpiece among the numbered single-player Final Fantasy games. For as often as Square Enix has thought of chasing Final Fantasy VII success again, I find that much of the modern series in actuality has been trying to recapture Final Fantasy X. Games such as Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy VII Remake's first part, and Final Fantasy XVI feature linear environment and an incredibly story-driven game. They all, including 15 on this front, use systems that resemble something like the Sphere Grid. Yet despite all of this, there are so many people that consider Final Fantasy X to be the last of its kind. The games after Final Fantasy X certainly aren't bad games. Games like Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth can be argued as the absolute apex of the series' offerings. However, there is still a reverence for 10, as this is the last great self-contained masterpiece changed video games forever. And today I want to explore why there will never be another game quite like Final Fantasy X, while also presenting analysis on why, even though contemporary FF games have some of the same qualities superficially, such as linearity and a skill tree that reminds people of the Sphere Grid, Final Fantasy X still remains one of a kind. Final Fantasy X's narrative is driven by its characters, and I think every character in this game is fantastically written. Tidus is normally the type of character I hate. On the surface level, a happy-go-lucky shonen protagonist who only sees the good in things, is entirely optimistic and wants to be the hero. Is this character sounding familiar to you? Because there's a lot of characters like them inside of FF and outside. For the most part, this trope is so common because it's so inoffensive and darn near engineered in a lab to be likable. It's also because this trope is trying so hard to be likable, I can find it off-putting. The trope will often see writers trying to put every likable and relatable quality into a character to the point of where they simply don't feel believable as a real person anymore. But Tidus isn't your run-of-the-mill sunshine boy. Though Tidus outwardly shows the cheery side of himself, his internal monologue is wholly the opposite. It's the monologue of a person who is depressed and struggling with deep internal turmoil. He is lost both metaphorically and figuratively. I find it incredibly fitting that there is a parallel between him and Yuna that always makes them have to show the best sides of themselves, even when they're feeling at their worst, because they have fathers in the spotlight, a feeling I can only imagine that children of politicians and celebrities actually have to go through, as their lives have these pressures placed on them from frame 1. This narration allows for us to know which parts of Tidus' cheeriness are truly authentic and what he is struggling with deeper down. Now finding himself in a culture where outward expression of many thoughts could be considered outright blasphemous, this withholding of one's true feelings becomes emblematic of all Aspira under Yevon. This is a large part of what separates Tidus from the shonen pack, is that more than just having father issues, he actually displays them. Indeed, Tidus engages in what can only be called fatherless behavior, which is wild because as many shonen protagonists that have been abandoned by their fathers, you'd think that more of them would be expressive about it. Even though Jecht never actually chose to walk away from Tidus, Tidus still experiences feelings of abandonment about this regardless, a phenomenon that often does happen in real life. In fact, he seemingly has a difficult time accepting this even after learning the truth. His relationship with Jecht is complicated and feels incredibly realistic. Jecht, for the most part, as a father and husband, is self-centered. Jecht has a drinking problem which he never addresses until arriving in Spira, where he decides to quit drinking because he got drunk and attacked a shoe puff in Moonflow. This was difficult for Tidus to process, as his father couldn't stop drinking for him, couldn't stop for his mother, as if they weren't enough. At the same time, much of the public never knows to the full extent what kind of man Jecht is at home. They only know the kind of man he presents himself to be, which leads Tidus to only have to hear about how great his father is, only for him to seemingly be transported 1,000 years into the future, only to hear people still telling him about how great his dad was, and he's incredibly lucky to have him. This must have been beyond frustrating for Tidus. While Tidus is struggling to be anything but his father, father, Yuna is struggling to live up to hers. She sees her father as a great man who sacrificed everything for the calm, to bring people peace, if only for a little while. Yuna grows up seeing the impact of this sacrifice, the power of people being able to sleep in their beds at night without the fear of their lives being destroyed, their bloodlines being lost, entire cities crumbling. It may seem pointless to sacrifice herself to stop sin, especially when sin is only going to come back. The calm is finite and is said to only be getting increasingly shorter. Sin will come back, and he will come back faster and faster. However, I think when you see the death and destruction that comes with sin, it becomes a very easy decision to understand. And although it may be an easy decision to understand, that doesn't make it an easy decision to swallow. Yuna is going to die. At 17 years old, she has chosen to give up her life for the sake of others. Every place that Yuna parts with is filled with sadness, knowing that this is a place she will never see again. Every face that she has to say goodbye to is under the pretense that it is truly goodbye. Despite this, Yuna decides to persevere through her journey, smiling the whole way. She wanted her journey to be filled with laughter and not for this to be a long, dragged out funeral. However, there was one unforeseen variable that would stop Yuna from being the perfect lamb for this system: the presence and love of Tidus. Yuna has now developed an earthly attachment, an outside influence that was able to make her question truths that she found unquestionable. The romance of Tidus and Yuna is the best in the Final Fantasy series and one of the best in video games to me by a wide margin. A common trope in JRPGs is for romances of two characters who have known each other their entire lives and already have established chemistry to get together. It's always been hard for me to relate to this. Me, as well as all the other couples I know, met later in life, teenagers at the latest. Tidus and Yuna are the opposite of the JRPG status quo. We see the entirety of Tidus and Yuna's relationship forming on screen. The formation of their dynamic, their chemistry. We see the progression of them going from acquaintances to friends to lovers. As a result, we intimately know what the nature of this relationship is like, and we also have an increased attachment to it. Whereas in some JRPGs, we can just be told that two characters have always been in love from the very second they were born. Trust me, bro. Then their relationship has to be supplemented for through the use of flashbacks when they were kids. But before we go any further, I want to be really clear here. I am not saying this trope is bad or always lackluster. It can be done really well, and it certainly has been done really well. That being said, it has also been done a lot. There are definitely people who prefer the former, as it wouldn't be done so frequently if they didn't. That being said, I definitely prefer the way Tidus and Yuna are presented. In the grander scheme of JRPG relationships, this game subverts the typical. These two don't grow up in the same town or share the same values about life. Two people from different religious backgrounds with different beliefs in two wildly different places, finding common ground together. A very rare breakaway from the tropes that are often used and define the genre at times, and to a great effect. Yuna is an incredible heroine, from her design to her character, but she's most fascinating as a figure who breaks free and re-examines her own culture, society, and even religion in areas where they clearly no longer serve the greater good as we apply rational thought, free from the biases we've been taught our whole lives. And this is what Final Fantasy X begs us to do. It wants us to consider our teachings and traditions and ask if they truly make sense to us. This is exemplified by Wakka's prejudices against the Al Bhed and the use of Machina. With Machina, there is absolutely no real reason they're inherently bad. Machines, like anything else in the world, are a neutral entity. They can be used for bad as they can also be used for good. So to see them as outright evil because we were taught at a young age they simply are, exemplifies the sort of biases we can all be taught growing up in real life. For example, at one point in real life, there were prejudices against people who were left-handed. If you stop and think about this for even a brief moment, you wouldn't be able to find anything that was actually wrong with this as a natural consequence. There's just the fact that everyone around you says it is bad, but there's nothing observable that you can point to and say that's actually bad. It becomes bad simply because people identify it as bad and everyone agrees with the sentiment. In the same fashion, Wakka's hypocrisy, and the greater hypocrisy of Yevon, is revealed when they're okay with Machina that do things like automate the Blitzball Stadium. Some Machina are arbitrarily good, some are bad, but it's not about the end result of using them that result in that distinction. It's about what my friends and family say. The Maesters of Yevon and its teachings say it's bad. It's only later, when Wakka is confronted with these lies directly, that he is forced to reprocess these ideas entirely. There's also Wakka's relationship with Riku, and the underlying tension of him not knowing Riku is Al Bhed for a long while after they meet. Moreover, he also doesn't know that with Riku being Yuna's cousin, that means that Yuna is also part Al Bhed. The woman that he is sworn to guard has lineage of the ones he perceives as traitors to Yevon. This is curious to me, as I feel Al Bhed have very distinct features. In particular, their green eyes that have a spiral-shaped pupil. It seems like at any point he could just look Riku in the eye and know that she was Al Bhed. Is this a plot hole? Perhaps. But there's another way of thinking about it. There's an aspect of human nature that makes it easy to hold on to prejudices of a group of people whenever they're just merely a concept in your head. That dehumanization often melts away when we meet and interact with these people and realize that they're just human beings living their lives and doing what they think is right. However, when they're far away and they're only whatever we project onto them, it's easy to project biases against them. After all, without knowing them up close, you really don't have any counterexample to prove the opposite either. And Riku is immediately introduced as a friend, has approval from Sir Aaron, and so I'd like to think that this initial framing of her as a friend and comrade prevents his mind from ever even conceiving her as being the same as the foe, despite it being painfully obvious. And not to theorize too much, I do think it's interesting that Al Bhed have this spiral-shaped pupil. Spira's namesake indeed comes from the word spiral, a spiral of death and sacrifice. The Al Bhed, as people outside of the religion of Yevon, perhaps seeing that spiral for exactly what it is, and thus them wanting to break that cycle by stopping summoners like Yuna from completing their pilgrimage, is the deeper symbolism of their spiral pupils. Or perhaps the curtains really are just blue for no deeper reason, but it is an interesting thought. Riku in herself is an upbeat character in the hit sequel to Yuffie Kisaragi. Both are bubbly thief characters coming from a foreign nation that is hated and often discriminated against by the ruling organization, which threatens to undermine them. Creative Studio One really likes this trope of character, and it's endearing. Thus, I find it really interesting that Riku has a line where she says that she wants to be like Lulu, a character who is the exact opposite of her, a stoic black mage of few words. And the words that she does have are oftentimes brutal. Riku and Lulu are great counterbalances to each other within the group, each representing the qualities that each other lacks. Riku's vibrant personality injects a sense of hope and resilience into the group, even in the darkest moments of the journey, while Lulu's cold, tell it as it is approach often grounds the party in the truth, a necessary armor forged from past trauma and losses. Lulu is also struggling with quite a lot here. The loss of Chapu, Wakka's brother, as well as Lulu's love interest, was killed in the battle against Sin, and though this loss leads to them having a lot of tension with each other, it's also that same trauma that leads them to falling in love. And while I don't think I need to explain to you the taboos of eventually getting pregnant by your dead partner's brother, one can only hope that it meets the approval of Chapu's ghost by the end. Sir Aaron is the character that commands the most respect among the party, however, and he's also the oldest party member, which is wild to me because Aaron is 35 years old, although his wrinkles and gray hair would suggest that he is much older than that. Is this just a continuation of the trend of Square Enix not understanding what someone in their 30s looks like? Probably, but I have a bit more of a meaningful interpretation. You see, Aaron was killed by Unalesca and became an Unsent at 25 years old. He was also notably much younger looking at this time. Unsent aren't bound to the same physical laws as the living, and as a result, they don't age. And yet Aaron here looks significantly older. The stress, the trauma, and the heavy responsibilities he carries contribute to his weathered, older appearance. And thus, as a result, it manifests him as an older looking man than he should be. This is just my theory on it, and I'm sure others have came to a similar conclusion before, though to my knowledge, there isn't any outright confirmation on it. But I think it strengthens the character even further further, and until Yoshinori Kitase or Tetsuya Nomura tell me that I'm wrong, I'm going to keep believing it. Aren is cool, mysterious, and everything I hoped I would be growing up. Unfortunately for Kid NSP, I grew up and became this goofy guy. His anger at the system of Yevon, the willingness to tear down that system that continues the spiral, is at the core theme of Final Fantasy X and its overarching narrative. And that narrative is one that is absolutely powerful. It is fundamentally, at its core, about challenging one's own society, culture, and religion when it needs to be reevaluated. Sin is inspired by mythological sea monsters and the concept of collective human guilt. It's designed to embody an unstoppable force of nature and a profound symbol of humanity's sins against the teachings of Yevon. Sin symbolizes the cyclical nature of destruction and guilt, reflecting how societies and individuals are trapped in a cycle of punishment and penance for their transgressions. This parallels the real-life concept of the shame of sin, where people often carry the burdens of their past wrongdoings, perpetuating a cycle of guilt and atonement that can be difficult to break. However, the followers of Yevon believe that if they are faithful to the teachings, if they can eventually atone for the sins of their ancestors, that one day, if they keep doing the final summoning and hold the faith, sin would finally be gone. That one day, the cycle would be broken. But little did they know, that was the exact thing continuing the cycle. Sin was created during the machine war between Bavel and Zanarkand, when Zanarkand's leader, Yu Yevon, devised a plan to both preserve Zanarkand and defeat Bavel. As Zanarkand faced defeat, Yu Yevon transformed the surviving citizens into faith, using them to summon a dream version of Zanarkand, hidden away at sea. To protect this dream and ensure it remained undiscovered, Yu Yevon summoned Sin, a massive entity with the purpose of destroying any city that grew too large or relied on technology. However, the strain of controlling Sin overwhelmed Yu Yevon, turning him into a mindless entity focused solely on maintaining the summoning. This led to Sin becoming a monstrous force that indiscriminately attacked civilians. Over time, Yunalesca introduced the final Aeon as a means of temporarily defeating Sin, creating a cycle of destruction and temporary calm periods. The Yevon Temple in Bavel capitalized on this cycle, establishing a religion that taught sin was a punishment for humanity's sins, thus by offering Spira hope through the promise of eventual salvation, all the meanwhile administering eternal damnation. All of this was done by taking a phenomenon that people couldn't explain, having powerful figures explain it, and offering a means in order to make it go away, and thus seemingly verifying their claims. And that's one thing that people fail to understand about Yu Yevon. Yu Yevon is absolutely not God, nor is Yu Yevon anything like a god. Let me be clear here, even though I am a JRPG enjoyer, one of my least favorite things about JRPGs is killing God to defy fate. Don't get me wrong, I love it when it's a guy like Sephiroth trying to become God. I find man's ascent to godhood to be incredibly fascinating, and I think there's a lot of room and differing motivations that characters can have for wanting that kind of power. But I'm not a big fan of when the final boss is God, the creator of the planet and humans, has decided that Earth no longer suits him, or that humanity has been given far too many chances and now it's time for extinction. It's cliche, it's overdone, to the point of it almost being the default JRPG story, and it's not exactly what I would call thought-provoking anymore. But Yu Yevon again is not God. He is a mortal man and a summoner just like Yuna, who managed to manifest a being like Sin, and through lies spread about him and his teachings, created an entire religion around him. Of course, even still, Yevonites don't necessarily worship Yevon as the creator god, but more so as a spiritual teacher. This follows the influence of the many Eastern religions that inspired Yevonism. This also defies most JRPG tropes that explicitly look toward Abrahamic inspirations to create these figures. The result is that even though Yevonism appears to follow many JRPG tropes, such as church bad, is indeed true here to an extent, it also implements it in a way that most other JRPGs don't. Of course, ascending to the head of Yevonism is Maester Seymour Guado. Seymour is also seeking salvation for the people of Spira in the most twisted way possible. By taking control of Sin, Seymour aims to kill everyone on the planet and turn them all into unsent. By doing this, there will be no more death or pain in Spira. Everyone would be an undead ghost who no longer requires mortal needs. This would destroy the cycle of nature, and while being an unsent seems like an ultra cool option to just not die when you don't want to, unsent risk losing their sense of selves by becoming consumed by negative negative emotions like anger, jealousy, or despair. This can eventually cause them to transform into fiends. You could still probably make an argument that there is something correct about the way that Seymour is approaching things, and that it is better than the alternative here. But I think the entire planet being haunted by ghosts is just something that is ultimately unsettling. Final Fantasy X is layered with multiple different antagonists, from Seymour to Sin to Yu Yevon to Jecht to whoever decided on the movement controls for Blitzball, and all these different moving pieces come together to make an interesting, multifaceted conflict, something that I feel can be lacking in the contemporary games of the series sometimes, but it's what makes the journey throughout Spira so interesting. Spira in itself is just one-of-a-kind locations in video games. I legitimately cannot even think of another game that comes close to looking like this one. I think this is also a strength of Final Fantasy in its golden era, that each game would take the series somewhere brand new and present a visual identity that the world hasn't seen before, and still remains unique among the landscape of video games. Yoshinori Kitase noted that when they began work on Final Fantasy X, he had received complaints from longtime fans that Final Fantasy had gone too far away from its medieval roots. This came especially post Final Fantasy VII and VIII, but Kitase wasn't a fan of this idea. Kitase wanted to challenge the notion that fantasy had to be European and medieval, and while Final Fantasy IX would eventually satisfy the purists looking for this type of game, Kitase and the team we know of as Creative Studio 1 would look throughout Asia for inspiration, finding a direction for where to take this game next. The end result of this was creating a setting, visuals, and atmosphere, the likes of which we've never seen before and arguably have never seen again. Its heavy use of water, a world spread across islands and island cultures, a unique sense of fashion where every character in this entire game is wearing the most insane thing you've ever seen, and music that is absolutely ethereal, composed by Nobuo Uematsu, known for his tracks that focus more so on melody, and Masashi Hamauzu, whose tracks tend to be more atmospheric. They combine forces on this soundtrack for a result that is equal parts emotionally resonant and deeply immersive. Final Fantasy X would push the PlayStation 2 to its limits, becoming a quintessential demonstration of how powerful the new system was. But it wasn't just raw technical prowess, it was also through incredible art direction, choice of setting, and how they chose to display each scene. Square Enix's pre-rendered cinematic studio Visualworks did their absolute best creating the FMVs for this project. These are still absolute marvels to look at, and felt light years ahead of anything else on the market when they first arrived in 2001. In particular, water and hair were difficult things to animate during this time in animation, and arguably still are to a large extent. However, Visualworks produced industry-leading results when it came to this, making the world of Spira something absolutely breathtaking and that has truly lasted the test of time. Though the resolution, even on the remasters, is upscaled and cropped, I'm willing to bet that if you could somehow re-render these at 4K, they would still look stunning, because I don't even mind looking at them in blurry 480p. Of course, a game is more than just its cinematics, it's also its combat system. In terms of combat, Final Fantasy X is a puzzle game. Each battle revolves around the player looking at the resources that they have, what abilities they have unlocked on the sphere grid, and figuring out a way to defeat the enemy. Turn order is posted in the right corner, with the game allowing you to preview how each action will affect the turn order before you commit to it. And it's this simple mechanic that allows for a depth of strategy to take root. Some characters like Riku are fast and can stock multiple turns in a row. Using items is faster than attacking, and haste will allow your party to stack multiple turns. There are near endless possibilities on how you can approach things. Previous Final Fantasy games would determine turns by an active time gauge, meaning enemies could keep attacking you if you sat the controller down. In Final Fantasy X, they would return to a true, pure turn-based system, known as the Conditional Turn-Based Battle System, or CTB, where time was no longer a factor. And holy crap, do I prefer this system over traditional ATB. It's snappier, significantly more strategic, and offers so much more variety in battle. Limit breaks return in the form of overdrives. However, what makes overdrives unique is that there is a myriad of ways in which you can charge them. In the menu, each character has different conditions that can be set to change the overdrive, the character taking damage, allies getting hit, or simply the number of turns that go by, and much more. That means that you can set how you want your overdrive to charge charge based on the type of battle that you're going to be facing, and the way you think that character best plays. This is where the depth of customization that Final Fantasy X offers begins to come through. Also new to Final Fantasy, and one of the most highly requested features to return to the series right now, is the ability to swap party members out mid-battle. Each party member fulfills a unique FF job in this game, and you're able to swap them out all freely at any time, so long as the character you're swapping them with is still alive. This takes the complexity of strategy even further, as now you're both considering the turn order and when to move characters in and out of battle. This allows for creativity to thrive with the myriad of tools that you have here. You can look for enemy weaknesses. You can use Tidus's time magic to ensure that you get more turns than the enemies do. Buffs and debuffs actually matter here. You can use Riku's items and fast attacks to stack more turns, and then swap to another character to finish off your round of turns. You can use Yuna to control summons, stocking up Aeon overdrives and then unleashing them all on the enemy. Speaking of Aeons, in previous FF games, summons for the most part just did a powerful attack and then left. They were incredibly visually impressive, but oftentimes they really didn't mix up gameplay in any meaningful way. New to the FF series, you can now control your summons entirely, choosing their moves as well as using them to be able to shield powerful oncoming attacks, giving them even more utility. Each boss in the game has incredibly unique mechanics that conjure specific memories of how players dealt with those enemies. And this is still true, even though it's been years since my last playthrough. For example, anyone watching this video, if I just mention Yunalesca, you probably have some very specific memories on dealing with Zombie. You might even recall specific strategies or frustrations you had overcoming this. This game has boss fights that leave an imprint on you. When compared to contemporary FF games like Final Fantasy XV, it's hard to think of a boss in that game that even comes close to this experience. Most you simply held square and warp striked until they were dead. One thing I noticed in my chat is that every single person had different ideas on how to beat the boss, and what's more incredible is that the vast majority of them were very much viable. Furthermore, each person has made different discoveries or grinded to different places on the sphere grid, and so had different tools that they could all use to solve each problem. All of this is an absolute testament to how much flexibility this system has, and just how deep it actually is. The battle system in this game is incredible. However, I think with any great RPG battle system, a great progression and character growth system has to be standing behind it in order for it to truly shine, and that is absolutely the case with Final Fantasy X. New to the series was a brand new system of character growth, the sphere grid. Rather than characters gaining levels and increasing predetermined attributes, players instead would be given sphere levels, which allow them to move along a grid and spend these points to unlock new nodes. It is incredibly easy to look at the sphere grid and think that this is just a skill tree. However, there is so much that sets this apart from any skill tree you've ever seen. Each node, of course, contains different stats and abilities, but you can't just immediately go back to any other branch in the tree or select other boosts or abilities at any time. If you want to do this, you will have to have enough S levels to go all the way back. While this may sound inconvenient at first, less S levels are required to move further back on the grid than they are to move forward. And more importantly, it makes the player commit to something. Not something irrevocable, but it makes them have to sit with their choice at least for a little while. This makes each choice have a lot more weight to it, and as a result, makes it more engaging to interact with the sphere grid, much more strategic and much more meaningful. Another thing that separates the sphere grid from your run-of-the-mill skill trees is the fact that this system is entirely interconnected, meaning that it's possible for your characters to learn skills outside of the roles they're normally supposed to fulfill. This allows you to hybridize your character's role in battle, though there is criticism that by the end game, every character, aside from Yuna's exclusive summoning, ultimately ends up being the same. Honestly, this is an issue with more FF games than just this one, but my rebuttal would be, that's fine. This isn't going to be an issue that you see until very deep into the post-game with the super bosses. However, for most of the experience and for most players, they're going to get a deep level of customization and build options for their playthrough. Another thing that separates the sphere grid from contemporary skill trees, especially ones that came after Final Fantasy X, are the empty nodes. That's right, sometimes you spin levels on the sphere grid and get absolutely nothing. On the surface level, this seems like it would actually be something to criticize the system for, but on the contrary, it's where a lot of the system's genius comes in. For starters, starters, you get S levels more frequently than you'd level up in pretty much any RPG. So this means you're constantly engaging with the sphere grid the entire game. Each upgrade also makes a more tangible difference in combat. Empty nodes are a great way to cool this system off, but they also serve as a system that is somewhat comparable to materia in FF7. Throughout the game, you'll find spheres that can plug into these empty nodes, and they allow you to do all sorts of things. A black magic sphere will allow a character to learn any black magic move that another character has learned on the sphere grid already, no matter where they currently are on the sphere grid. Or you can use something as simple as an HP sphere that turns an empty node into an HP sphere. Now, let's contrast this with contemporary FF growth systems. Final Fantasy XIII's Crystarium looks like a more visually appearing sphere grid, but it's actually significantly more streamlined. For starters in this game, there are only 3 stats: HP, Strength, and Magic, and that's literally it. So already, we're starting off rough here. There's a forced cap on the Crystarium each chapter to prevent you from over-leveling. You can always easily go back and level up branching paths you missed. There is no consequence, you can always just go back. While making it more convenient than the sphere grid, it also removes any weight of choice that you had. It isn't interconnected, so there's really no way to break off from the beaten path and do anything unique with your character. The only decision that you really get in this system is which role you want to empower first. But in the end, these things all have fairly objective answers. Combine this with the fact that all the character roles aren't unlocked until later, the player is pretty much robbed of their choice. All of these things could also be said about Final Fantasy XVI's growth system, which is literally a set of abilities that you can dump AP into without any choice on Clive's stats. We have to acknowledge that these are different games with different systems, and they should not just copy Final Fantasy X. Nobody is saying that, I'm not saying that, don't say that I'm saying that. But when we highlight the strengths and weaknesses of these systems, it becomes apparent why the sphere grid is still so unmatched. There are also no empty nodes in this system, which of course means that there's no sort of items that you can find that contribute to your character's growth in any meaningful way, which leads to one of the most important strong points about Final Fantasy X. This game has some of the best itemization in the series, if not the best itemization. For those unfamiliar with the term itemization in video games refers to the system by which players acquire, equip, and manage items, such as weapons, armor, consumables, and other items in order to enhance their character's abilities and performance. That is to say, how you get items, why you're getting those items in the first place, what meaningful utility they have, which then ultimately defines the value of these items in the context of the game. Final Fantasy X has a variety of different uses from items inside and outside of battles. Of course, there is the standard Final Fantasy trappings of using potions, elixirs, and Phoenix Downs, but there's also a large variety of other items that players can find in the game, including spheres, armors, grenades, items that grant shell, protect, and so much more. Of course, these items have the standard utility that you might imagine, but they can be used for oh so much more. Customizing your weapons and armor in this game so they can have various bonuses, allowing your characters to avoid status elements like zombie and poison, giving them an increase in HP. And while these weapons, when you find them, will have certain fixed abilities, you can also add additional abilities on top of that, meaning that you have a ton of flexibility with your equipment. You can also use items to power up your summons so they can learn new abilities or increase their stats. Of course, there is also Riku's Overdrive. Returning for the first time since Final Fantasy V, players can mix 2 items together to create a brand new unknown effect, which has seemingly endless different possibilities. This can be used for things such as combining 2 potions together to make a stronger potion, or even combining items that allow you to unlock the trio of 9s, allowing your party to consistently hit the first damage cap with every single ability used by your party. The itemization in this game allows for endless possibilities on how you customize your builds. It means that you should in fact open every single treasure chest that you come across. You should in fact steal from every single enemy that you can. You should solve every puzzle and explore every corner. You can also find Albet primers, which help you learn the tongue of Spira's green-eyed people. Once complete, you can import your primers into a new save file, allowing you to experience all the Albet dialogue again, but this time with fluency. The end result is that every item you find is valuable in some way, shape, or form. Just from hearing this and thinking about it, you can see just how important itemization is. To compare with modern FF games such as Final Fantasy XIII or XVI, there is almost nothing useful to find outside of crafting materials in these games. Final Fantasy XVI, for example, has some very big, very beautiful zones, and you want to go to them and find something really interesting. But unfortunately, there's just no secret thing that you can really find that would actually be useful for you. Because of the way the game is built, because of the itemization, there's not going to be an item that you find that increases Clive's strength unless it's a crafting item for a sword. There's not going to be a moment in these games where you find a useful ability or anything like that. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that there's never really a time in these games where you get an item and have that holy crap, this is so useful moment, because the game design simply does not allow for meaningful itemization to even exist. It's a very stark contrast, and one I hope that Final Fantasy games will fix in the future. But the center of modern Final Fantasy discourse is always about linearity. Final Fantasy X, throughout most of its journey, is a very linear game. Later, you acquire the airship and you're able to revisit locations as well as unlock new ones. However, people often wonder why a game that is more linear, like Final Fantasy XIII, gets so much criticism for it, while Final Fantasy X is loved for it. I've always thought the reasons for this were really obvious, and nowhere near as confounding as it's made out to be. Final Fantasy X, for starters, is simply better paced. Final Fantasy XIII's battles look fast, but Final Fantasy X's battles actually are fast, with most normal battles ending very fast if you target the appropriate enemy weaknesses. Now, don't get me wrong, there are definitely some longer battles that occur later on in the game, and thankfully the remaster has 2x and 4x speed that allow grinding to go by even faster. However, even without grinding, Final Fantasy X has battles that simply feel snappier most of the time. Each area in Final Fantasy X is also at most a few screens long. The areas are significantly smaller. They're also more interesting to explore with more secrets in them, and the secrets are actually valuable when you find them. Both games have branching paths with the treasure chest, but in Final Fantasy X, again, you actually find items that are useful. Final Fantasy X also creates scenarios where you interact with the world differently through puzzle solving, dodging lightning, or various mini-games that shake up the pacing. And no, a lot of these are not great. I agree, a lot of them suck. And the Cloister of Trials in particular can be incredibly frustrating and just outright unenjoyable at times. But they serve a deeper function, and they fulfill exactly that. They create gameplay variety, such that you aren't just running down a hallway fighting battles, watching a cutscene repeat. In fact, you can always take a break from battles and play Blitzball. And more directly, Final Fantasy X is, in full honesty, generally considered a better story with more enjoyable characters. So when I am walking forward to cutscene and fight, I enjoy doing it more because I'm more captivated by what's going on. In a game like FF13, you can't even backtrack to any previous location aside from Pulse. Once you visit that location in a playthrough, you will never see it again unless you replay the game. Final Fantasy X, however, encourages you to go back and explore those areas and unlock new secrets, as well as a map system that lets you discover new areas through coordinates and passwords. Linearity is not the issue here. In fact, most video games by definition are linear. The difference simply is Final Fantasy X finds ways to engage the player throughout its fixed journey, offering both real gameplay choice as well as satisfying illusions of choice that continues to mix things up so that you're never doing the same thing for too long. And to be more blunt, just also has a more relatable tale with characters that are more grounded. As a result, it remains no secret that Final Fantasy X remains in the hearts and minds of gamers to this day, with the Final Fantasy X series selling over 21 million units worldwide. Through my most recent playthrough of this game for this video, I couldn't help but fall in love with it all over again. And now, this game, by many, is still considered to be one of the best entry points in the series, giving the absolute best of new and old. And it's not just the fans who still love Final Fantasy X. Square Enix has, on many occasions, talked about a potential for a Final Fantasy X-3. Tetsuya Nomura had this to say on the matter, quote, "If we are to make a Final Fantasy X-3, we somehow have a synopsis written by Nojima-san. It's sleeping right now, but the plot itself does exist." It's interesting to know that him saying here the plot of Final Fantasy X-3 does exist. They really want to do this. Nomura has already drawn portraits for the designs of what Tidus and Yuna would look like in such a hypothetical game. Tidus sporting Jack's headband, and Yuna now with long flowing hair, and it's alluded to that she's practicing the art of summoning again. But can you make a game that stands next to one of the greatest of all time? Do we really need to revisit Spira? especially when we can already do that with another playthrough? Do we need to yet again undo one of the most meaningful endings in video games, just so that we can feel the rush of when our feet first touch the sand of Besaid Island? There's a part of me that would not say no to this, or even no to a remake of this game. But just like there's also a part of me that wants to go into my freezer and eat an entire half-gallon of ice cream, I also know that it's not good for me, even though it's tempting. Instead, what I want Square Enix to do is understand why a game like Final Fantasy X is so untouchable and widely loved. Not to simply recreate Final Fantasy X, not to make another game like Final Fantasy X, but to realize how Final Fantasy X embodies the spirit of Final Fantasy laid out by previous games and elevated it to the next level. A brand new world like we've never seen before, drawing inspiration from culture, locations, and settings that we haven't seen before used in video games. To look at a rich, diverse cast of party members who all have their different roles in this found family, as well as different roles in combat, all of which are playable. And most importantly, they have a journey that we'll never forget. There will never be another game like Final Fantasy X, but I hope that it inspires other games, other Final Fantasy games, to be a game unlike any other.